Paul would be shocked if we took his writings and made them into Torah. As far as women in ministry and what they were doing in the church, that whatever the gifts indicated, then who are we to hold them back? It's a gift-oriented thing, not a gender thing.
Do you want to have peace no matter the circumstances and be present and joyful even in your busy life? Do you find yourself awake late at night, anxious about the future and what your next step should be? Do you wake up filled with doubt and struggling to trust God and yourself to manage the realities of life? Welcome to the Peaceful Christian Woman podcast. Hi, I'm Alexandra, mom of two, wife and daughter of the King. I too felt trapped in a cycle of stress and overwhelm. I dwelled in the past, worried about the future, and was too distracted by comparison and people-pleasing to enjoy the present. It wasn't until I embraced God's word, His attributes, and my own responsibility for my thoughts and emotions that I discovered the joy of complete surrender so I could finally feel peace. In this podcast, you will find simple yet powerful tools to release control, transform your thinking, and embrace your dreams so that you can rest in God's mighty hand, trusting Him through life's twists and turns. So crack open your Bible, brew your favorite cup, and get ready to find peace together. For years, I had doubts and a misunderstanding of God's plan that left me feeling undervalued and stuck for so long. I realized that these beliefs stemmed from my past and some losses I had experienced early on, but also some incorrected practices in the church that are not biblical. I realized the need for clarity and I kept searching. And recently I discovered Gordon Ferguson's book, The Bible and Women, and it was a revelation. Today I am thrilled to share my conversation with Gordon himself. We will be talking about God's intentions and original design for women. The truth truly sets you free. And I hope you feel encouraged, find renewed confidence, you learn something, and that it helps you deepen your intimacy with your Maker. Let's hear it. Gordon Ferguson is a graduate of Northwestern State University and the Harding School of Theology. With more than 50 years of experience, he has served as an evangelist, elder, and teacher. Gordon has written 18 books and produced many audio-video teaching series. He and his wife, Teresa, make their home in McKinney, Texas. For additional information about his work and ministry, you can go to his website, www.gordonferguson.org. Take a listen. Gordon, it's so nice to have you. And thank you for taking some time of your Saturday morning to be with me. I read your book, The Bible and Women. How did I miss so much? And it was really revealing. It was incredible because my identity is Christ, as the Bible says. But if we misunderstand, then our whole identity is shifted as well. And so we don't connect with our Creator the same way. And so I really appreciate you diving deep into the scriptures, having this open heart and never ceasing to being a disciple, learning of God's will and being led by the Spirit. So thank you so much for that. Let me dive into one pressing question that I have. You mentioned in your book that men and women were created to be the image bearer of God, and they were created in the midst of the spiritual battle. You say it's a conjecture that you have, that perhaps that's why we were created. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
The image of God is a very huge and broad subject. Basically, we're made in the image of God because He wanted a relationship with us. And so being made in His image means that we're intelligent beings who have the power of choice. And God wanted us to choose to love Him and to have a personal relationship with Him. And so that is our very construction. If that be true, then we are to be His image bearers once we know Him, because if we reflect Him to other people, then they will be drawn to Him as well. And so once I have a relationship with God, then I need to demonstrate His nature as best I can to everyone else. But as you look at that, Adam was incomplete in that, which I'll explain a little more. But Adam was incomplete in fully, at least as fully as a human can, fully representing the image of God. He needed someone else. And a part of that was the battle you spoke of, but it's broader than that, because as you look at God's creation of humans, the broader the spectrum gets, the more attractive actually we can become. For example, Eve's created, and then you have Adam and Eve who have a better image-bearing possibility. I know my wife and I have been married for 59 years. And so I work that into every conversation I can, and people are shocked. You've been married 59 years, and the common question is, how in the world did you do that? And so I get God into the conversation by saying that when we first got married, I was running from God, but he was faster than I was, and he caught up with me. And so once my wife and I got together on the God thing, it changed everything. And so I get a chance to witness that way. And the very fact that the two of us demonstrate something that's unusual, being married that long and still being madly in love, to demonstrate that carries the image of God to a further extreme, it seems to me. And then you look in Colossians and Ephesians in particular, and it says in Colossians that Jesus is the fullness of God in the flesh. And just looking at the Old Testament, you had a limited view of God. But when he became flesh, then we could identify with God and really understand him tons better. And in the same way, just as Christ was the fullness of God, we are described in Ephesians and Colossians as being, as a church, the fullness of Christ. And so just as people couldn't fully understand God without seeing him in flesh and blood, people can't really understand Jesus until they see him in our flesh and blood. And the church is called the fullness of Christ. So as you go from one person to a couple to more, that just gives us a better opportunity to demonstrate the image of God, the Imago Dei. And then you look back at the original beginning in Genesis 1 and 2, and I would say that Adam alone certainly could not represent the image of God in the way that he and Eve could together. For one thing, God by definition is Trinity. And so you have built into the nature of God relationship. And so Adam alone didn't have relationship. So Eve completed that, and that gave a better representation of the image of God. And then also, God is not male. I know that the male pronouns are used because of the setting of the patriarchal system, but God is neither male nor female. He has all the qualities of both. And so we needed male and female to demonstrate the image of God, both the male and female qualities that we normally associate with male and female. And God had that. Jesus had that. They both described themselves in the feminine and in the masculine in their characteristics. And so you had to have Adam and Eve to give a fuller picture of the image of God. Now, to your question more specifically, though, I think all of that's important, very important, actually. But then you get down to the battle. When you actually look at some of the passages that I included in the book, there's a fierce battle going on, way beyond what we typically conceive of. And so together, Adam and Eve were much more able to fight that battle. And as a married person, I know that I need my wife. There are battles I cannot fight alone. There are things that she helps me with that I'm unable to cope with well without her, and vice versa. And so the whole battle situation, when you look in all the passages that I referenced, there is a spiritual battle behind the scenes going on all the time. And I think God, in creating male and female as his image, the Imago Dei, I believe in that. He enables us to deal with Satan and to demonstrate something that this galactic battle is intended to demonstrate.
Mm-hmm. And we're fully equipped when we work together. We're more equipped to fight.
Exactly.
Very nice. Thank you. You also mentioned in your book that to understand God's plan for women in the New Testament, it is best understood in the context of family. And you refer to Ephesians 5. You do mention about the church, and so there's always this idea of God's family. Can you explain a little bit how, because that passage highlights more the Roman code for the order of how things were at the time. So how can we understand God's intent and role of women within this context?
If you have the Roman codes, it is very male-centric. Mm-hmm. The males have all the authority over everything, their wives, their slaves, their children, everything. And Paul, because that was such a popular thing, and Paul was trying to redefine relationships spiritually, Paul took the household codes and turned them upside down. And so they're very different. Now, a lot of people go to Ephesians 5 and look at the wives being submissive to their husbands and everything, and they focus on that and talk about, see, the man is the leader and he's the boss and all of that. And that just means we look at it without looking at the entire context. And so in the book, I just started at the end, because he ends in chapter 6 of Ephesians. He ends with the slave and master relationship. And so, of course, he says that the slaves are to obey their masters, but he says you obey as you are obeying Christ. You do it from the heart, not because you're forced to do it. You have the opportunity to submit in a way that can influence your master if they're not a Christian. And so he talks about the slave obeying as he would obey Christ. It's a whole different perspective. And then in this same passage, he talks about the masters, and he says, masters in the same way. Well, a master was never in the Roman codes addressed and telling him to do anything with a slave, because a slave was property. They could be treated any way you wanted to treat them. And yet he says here, you do the same thing and recognize that God is your master as well as the slave's master. Both of you are servants. And so that's the real focus of the New Testament and of Jesus' teaching, is to be a servant. He said the greatest of all is the slave of all, or the servant of all, in Matthew 20. And so that's undergirding every relationship with God. Every relationship in Christ is undergirded with the idea that we are first of all and last of all servants. And so he starts off with the slavery thing, and then he goes to the fathers and children. He says, children, obey your parents, which is always going to be right. But then he says, fathers, train your children, basically to know God, train them spiritually. That turned the codes upside down, because mothers were viewed as the ones that raised kids, not the fathers. And yet he puts that responsibility on the fathers, and he says, train your children, and he doesn't distinguish between male children or female children. And back in the Roman days, the males got trained, but not the girls got trained by mom to cook and all of that. But they didn't get trained in the way of the Lord. And of course, that is something that, again, is very different. Now, when you get to the male-female relationship, he begins the whole house code section in verse 21 with submit to one another. And so everything that he says from there on, whether it's a husband's relationship with his wife, or the wife with a husband, or the children with the parents, the father with the children, the slaves with the master, and vice versa, all of that is under the heading of submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. And so it talks about the woman being submissive to the husband, But then he describes the husband being submissive to the wife in a way that to me is overpowering. I look at that and think, okay, I can focus on my wife if I want to and what she should be doing, but I'm overwhelmed with what he says about the husbands. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. So all of Ephesians 5 is about being servants, about putting others ahead of yourselves. And it's not ordering relationships as to who is over whom. It's ordering relationships in the sense that we all are under Christ and his authority.
Right.
And so it's a beautiful passage that puts us all under great responsibility to count others better than themselves, Ephesians 2, and to serve one another.
Right. Thank you.
So in my relationship with my wife, we are trying hard to outserve each other. My wife is much more naturally a servant than I am, but I have genuinely tried to imitate her. She's phenomenal. She has a gift of servanthood that's off the charts. I've never seen anyone with a better gift of servanthood than my wife. And of course, I and many others have been the beneficiary of that, but I try to imitate her. I don't have the same gift that she does, but I do have a gift to be a servant, a responsibility to be a servant. And so those with responsibilities that are not quite as strong as someone with a gift, they have the gift so that we can imitate them. And that's what I try hard to do with my serving wife.
Thank you. Yes, you mentioned about spiritual gifts, right, in your book as well. And at some point you mentioned that there was a conversation between Professor Bruce and Scott McKnight, and Professor Bruce's conclusion was, I'm for whatever God's Spirit grants women gifts to do, basically. And so can you explain a little bit about that concept about being led by the Holy Spirit and using our own gifts? And as you mentioned, you imitate your wife's gifts.
I mentioned in my book that today the foremost authority on Paul is generally considered to be Wright. I got his initials mixed up now. A.D. Wright, I think it is. Anyway, I might have that wrong. But he's the foremost authority on Paul. He's written massive books. I have several of them, and probably altogether they're that thick on Paul. Back in my day, when I first started training theologically, F.F. Bruce was the Pauline expert. And there were two things that he said, at least as he was quoted by McKnight there. Two things he said. One is that Paul would be shocked if we were looking at these difficult verses about women, like 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 13 or whatever, or 11 and 14. But he said Paul would be shocked if he thought we were turning the writings of Paul into Torah, making them law, rather than just addressing a specific situation at a given place. Because the Bible was not written to us, it was written for us, but it was written to the recipients of those days that were facing certain issues within certain locales. And so he was addressing what he said to those locales. Whether it had application in another, I don't know, unless he mentioned it in another, but he was addressing specific issues. And so for us to take that and to make it a universal law, McKnight said that Paul would be shocked if we took his writings and made them into Torah. The thing that you referenced is that Bruce also said that as far as women in ministry and what they were doing in the church, that whatever the gifts indicated, then who are we to hold them back? It's a gift-oriented thing, not a gender thing. And when you look, for example, at the gifts in Romans chapter 12, there's no indication that the gifts are gender oriented at all. And for example, to say that a woman may have the gift of servanthood and encouragement, but not have the gift of teaching and leadership, you can say that, but it's actually not true. It's not true in the Bible, and it's certainly not true in our relationships with one another today. I know and have relationships with extremely gifted women, great teachers, strong gifts of leadership. And so there's no indication in those passages that gifts are to be in any way gender delineated. They are simply there. And especially when you start off when the church was established in Acts 2, and he quotes from Joel 2 and says twice that women would prophesy. That was a foregone conclusion that was going to happen, and it did in the early church. And how we can look at that and say, well, that was back then, but now women need to be silent in church. That to me is shockingly bad exegesis.
Yes, and I love that final test that you write at the end of your book, where you mentioned the passage of Philippians 4 verses 2 and 3, where you change the name into man's name, but actually it refers to Yodia and Syntyche. And I myself actually thought that definitely when we put men, he mentioned these men because they're lead evangelists, they're talking about important matters. And when we mention women, it's emotional problems that they're arguing about. And so they were women lead evangelists in the first century church.
Yeah. And I know a number of them. We go through Romans 16 especially and show that these women are described in a way that they had to be leaders in the Roman church. And even one of them is called an apostle. And I dealt with that and the wording of it and so forth. But certainly there were women leaders. In the Philippians 4 thing that I did, or 4. The Philippians 4 thing is that we would look at these two women having a problem and assume that they were having some kind of a fight among women over nothing. And yet if we put men's names in the same passage, we would assume it was a theological issue, and somehow Paul was trying to straighten that out. It would be odd for him to address simply some kind of a personal issue. Right. And so I enjoyed doing that. It popped into my mind as I was writing that place.
Yes, it's very revealing.
Good illustration. Yeah, I think so.
Yes. You mentioned in your book that man and woman were created Genesis 1. Patriarchy came actually Genesis 3. So 2 chapters later, showing that patriarchy is not God's first intent, and that there's many consequences beyond even consequences towards women that patriarchy has caused in the world. And it's overwhelming when you mention here on page 68, where you say the first murder, first of all, Cain's violent murder of Abel, but then widespread oppression, endless wars, genocide, ethnic cleansing, massacre, Holocaust, discrimination, slavery, caste and class, racism, profiling, abuse, to mention just a few. Can you just maybe a little bit talk about that and how patriarchy benefits no one, truly?
Yeah, sometimes we've looked at Genesis 3, where sin entered and God gave the consequences for that. We have looked at that, and it says that to the woman, that your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. We've looked at that as actually God's ideal plan, but it was found in the midst of consequences of sin. That was never God's plan. And the problem with it is that after man ruled over woman in the very beginning with Adam and Eve, once you introduce that ruling over someone, having control and power over them, it spread to everyone, not just men over women. That's not even close to being the ultimate problem. It is men over men. It's always fighting for control. And so I have in the book the Merriam-Webster dictionary's definition of patriarchy. And it calls it a social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line broadly. And here's the broad definition: controlled by men of a disproportionately large share of power. And so I went through the wars that we have had and all the calamities, and men are at the head of the line in leading all of that and causing all of that. And right now we've got 2 wars going on, but who's leading the wars? Who started the wars? Who's in charge of the wars being in effect? And it's men. And I think men and women were created equal, but once man, and he was larger. He was built to be on the battlefield and in the cornfield farming and all of that. So he's built larger, and he can physically overpower someone smaller, whether it be a female or a male. But once that got started, the whole world has been saturated in it from then on. And millions of people have died in wars, and just so much under the heading of patriarchy.
Yeah. So we have a choice to make, and we can be part of the solution, following the prompting of the Spirit, or just go with that system again. Thank you so much. And then you mentioned also egalitarians versus complementarians, which was a middle ground. But then you really highlight that truly it is about servanthood. And you mentioned that earlier. Following Jesus is definitely that notion of being a servant and submit to one another. I don't know if you had anything more that you wanted to share about that.
2 years ago, right now, actually today, on this date, I was in the hospital fighting for my life. I had cancer. I had a reaction to the chemotherapy. And so I was in the hospital, and I thought I was going to die. I called the family in, tried to prepare them for me dying, but lots of prayers, and I didn't die. But one of the thoughts that hit me during the night was actually something a friend of mine said many years ago. He and I both were in schools training ministers, 2 different schools, but we became friends. But he said, you need to keep in mind that Jesus did not become a servant when he became a man. He became a man precisely because he is a servant. And so it hit me then that not only is God the God of gods, the Lord of lords, the King of kings, but he is the servant of servants. And if, in fact, the greatest of all is the servant of all, Jesus, God, has to be a servant through and through. And I really believe that he is. And so in Philippians, sometimes we talk about the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated. But I think the higher calling is what I call the platinum rule, and that is to count others better than self. And that's Ephesians 2. And he illustrates the principle by going on and talking about Jesus leaving heaven, coming down and being born as a man, and in fact, born in a very poor family in a very tough part of the world, and in a place that was generally looked down on, Nazareth. And Jesus emptied himself and then went all the way up to dying on a cross as a criminal in our place. And so when you understand the servanthood of Jesus and that we're called to imitate him, then everything that I do, whether it's in marriage or parenting or church or any other relationship, it has to have its very foundation, the idea of being a servant to everyone, counting them better than self and serving them. And so what's interesting, a lot of these thoughts hit me a little over a year ago when I was asked to speak in a Western Elders Conference in Denver. And so one of the lessons was about evangelists and elders working together. And so many times we have different leadership roles struggling a bit to really work together. It gets be the patriarchy problem in who's in charge here. And so I was doing this lesson and I came up with these quotes. Actually, Tom Jones is a very good friend of mine. And we've both written a lot of books. We've been friends for years. He at one time was the editor of DPI, where all of my early books were published. And so he sent me two quotes during this conference. I was speaking, and the night before I was speaking, he said he had this thought and wrote it down. And I said, this is destined to become a classic. The first one, though, it was from a poet, a contemporary poet, Kaylin Dion. But it says, power is not controlling other people. Power is controlling yourself. Trying to control other people is the first sign that you are entirely out of control. Controlling others is what weak people think power looks like. So Tom sent me that quote, but then he had one of his own. It popped into his mind, he said. But he wrote a book on humility one time. And I think this fits in well with the concept of what he wrote about in the book. But here's his quote. If humility is the key to the kingdom, and no one enters without humility, patriarchy, which is more associated with pride and control, may bring to mind another camel that cannot go through the eye of a needle.
Wow, that's powerful.
I said, Tom, I'll use that one. And what I ended up quoting then in the same seminar when I was speaking, because we were talking about elders and evangelists working together, but I wrote this down, and I later found it in the book by McKnight. The one that you quoted was Blue Parakeet, but his other book is called Tove, the Church of Tove, T-O-V. But anyway, the quote that I had was, team leadership cannot be successful long-term unless we truly embrace what Jesus taught in Matthew 20 and refuse to fit it into the world's view of leadership, talking about servanthood. I personally think that these issues cannot be fixed without fixing what I believe is a distorted, unbiblical view of women in both our physical and spiritual families. So that was the quote I made in that elders and wives conference. And it did seem to resonate, especially with the women.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing all this. And I'm glad that you're well. Definitely, I was one of the one praying. I saw what you were going through, and I will put in the show notes your website. Could you tell us where to find you and when you speak or when you have a book coming out? I'll definitely put the link to this book about the Bible and women. What is your website and where can we find you?
My basic teaching website is GordonFerguson.org, which is very simple. And there are tons of articles on there, most of them by me, but now and then I put one on by someone else that I think fits a particular need that I'm interested in. I have two Facebook pages. One is just look me up, Gordon Ferguson. I am maxed out on that one at 5,000 friends, so I can't usually add anyone, but here and now someone drops out, and so I can add somebody else. But then I have another teaching webpage, or rather a Facebook page, and it's just Gordon Ferguson Teaching Ministry. So that one's open to everyone. It's a public domain, and so I do have a lot of things on that as well. So those are my main ones I think that people would be interested in tuning into.
Very good. I will put the link in the show notes again. And thank you so much for your time. What a very invaluable time and insight. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If so, would you like to take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who may struggle with finding peace in her daily life? Also, please leave a quick review for the show on Apple Podcasts. It lights me up to know this podcast is helping you. Now, may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times in every way. The Lord be with you all. 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 16. Okay, time to go spread some kindness and maybe a little glitter, because why not? Remember, God shines through you. I'll meet you back next week for another episode. Bye for now.